Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 17, Section 1, The New Frontier. So, to start with, we've got to talk a little bit about some nicknames for Kennedy's presidency. And occasionally you may hear someone refer to the Kennedy years as Camelot. And this has something to do with the fact that on Broadway, the top musical at this time was called Camelot, about King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table and such. And in a way, a lot of people attributed what was happening with King Arthur to John F. Kennedy. Okay, there was a little romanticism that was kind of taking place here. The other is a concept called the New Frontier. You know, as the 1960s are beginning, we're in the midst of the space race. Kennedy is campaigning, talking about, the need to keep up with the Soviet Union. And at some point in time, maybe during his presidency, he even calls for the goal of putting a man on the moon before the end of the 1960s. So sometimes you may hear these years referred to by one of these nicknames. In 1960, a youthful John F. Kennedy narrowly defeated Richard M. Nixon in the presidential campaign. Nixon had been Dwight Eisenhower's vice president. Both men were roughly the same age, born around 1913. They had both served in World War II. And interesting enough, they both entered Congress in 1946, right after the war ended. So these two men, even though some people might say during some of the debates that Richard Nixon appeared to be a little bit older than Kennedy, Kennedy had a younger family, these men were the same age. And in 1960, we had the first presidential debate, okay, ever, meaning that the first time the two main candidates from the Republican and Democratic parties actually faced off before an audience debating the issues. What makes it even more interesting is not only was it the first ever presidential debate, it was also the first televised presidential debates. And there was actually more than one, but the first debate, which is not necessarily shown here in this image that we see below, both candidates showed up. Richard Nixon had been on the campaign trail. He had actually been sick the week before and was very pale and wore a lighter colored suit than the one that you see pictured here. And literally, he blended in to the background. It was almost like he was camouflaged. And so some people said that during the first debate, Richard Nixon didn't look very good. But for those who listened on the radio, Richard Nixon was just as competent as John F. Kennedy. Kennedy had been groomed for television. He had kind of prepared by spending some time out in the sun, so his skin was tanned, his hair was neatly cut, he looked refreshed. So, in number one, in the 1960 presidential race, both major parties made substantial use of television. The campaign centered on the economy and, of course, the Cold War. Hey, you can't escape that. We're right in the middle of it. If you take a look at the map, kind of on the bottom right hand side, any of the states that were colored blue were states that Kennedy had won. States that were in the red were states that Nixon had won. And so if you look kind of at Nebraska and its surrounding neighbors in the Midwest, for the most part, they pretty much went Republican. But if you look at states like Texas and along the East Coast, for the most part, they went with Kennedy. Next main idea. John Kennedy and his family gave the nation a youthful and enthusiastic first family. Kennedy was one of the presidents of more recent times that had very young children in the White House. Matter of fact, his daughter Caroline was, I think, about 3 years of age. And between the time that we have the election in May or election in November and the time that Kennedy is sworn in as president, him and his wife had another child, and they had baby John John. And John Kennedy, for the most part, by having this young family, just appeared to be a little more youthful to the public. I think the media did a fairly decent job of kind of keeping a distance, but people just loved the fact that they had a president that had small children in the White House. We hadn't had little kids in the White House really since the Roosevelt years. I'm talking Theodore Roosevelt. So, number three, in the 1960 election, Kennedy narrowly won the popular vote, and his victory in the Electoral College was only 303 votes to 219. So I wouldn't necessarily say that this was a landslide victory. It was kind of heated, and Richard Nixon, on his behalf, for losing, kind of fades off for a little while and kind of takes a back seat when we talk about being involved in politics. And he's going to kind of ride this out because he was a little sore about the fact that he lost to Kennedy. I think he thought that he was going to be a shoo-in for the presidency. But in time, Richard Nixon will come back and he'll obtain the presidency. Number four, Kennedy's inaugural address called on citizens to take more active roles in making the nation a better place. You might have heard the speech, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." This was something that came out of that inaugural address, and it was very inspiring for young people, particularly our baby boomers who were kind of coming of age, uh, being high school age, maybe in the 1960s. And so they have a tendency to put Kennedy kind of on a pedestal because he was really their president. Your next main idea. Despite an uneasy relationship with Congress, President Kennedy managed to get several parts of his domestic agenda passed. Domestic agenda is like what a president wants to do here at home. So, in number five, in an effort to increase growth and create more jobs, Kennedy advocated for deficit spending. Okay, deficit spending is basically spending more money than maybe our country is taking in. The last time we really had seen widespread deficit spending was during the New Deal under FDR. And Kennedy kind of continues with that. Number six, Kennedy asserted that lower taxes meant businesses would have more money to expand, and that as they expanded, they would create new jobs. This is something that's kind of interesting because if you look at modern day Republicans, this is something that they kind of buy into as far as their feelings about taxes. This idea, if you cut taxes, it will spur growth and hiring. And Kennedy was kind of backing that, which is really kind of interesting considering that, he was considered to be a very liberal Democrat. Your next main idea. Under Justice Earl Warren, the Supreme Court issued a number of decisions that altered the voting system, expanded due process, and reinterpreted aspects of the First Amendment. And in 1960, the Supreme Court ruled in several cases that upholding due process meant applying the Federal Bill of Rights to the states. And this kind of all happens within the 14th Amendment. And what we're going to find is that there are going to be several cases that are going to come up and actually are still coming up right now in the modern day and age that deal with the 14th Amendment and how due process is kind of levied at the state level. So if a state passes a law that is in contradiction, obviously, to the Constitution, obviously that's unconstitutional, but a lot of the challenges to that has to happen at the state level. Just a little side note, Earl Warren comes from California, and he actually was appointed Chief Justice by Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower appointed him thinking he would be a very conservative, probably not very controversial man. And what we find is that there are huge sweeping changes that are going to happen during the time that Earl Warren is at the helm of the Supreme Court. Number 8, in 1966, Miranda versus Arizona was a case where the court required that authorities immediately inform criminal suspects of their rights. Ernesto Miranda, who you see pictured below, really his name is significant when we talk about something called Miranda rights. And this is something that police officers have to read to individuals who are being arrested so that they are informed of their rights, whether or not they would want to say anything that could be used against them in the court of law, and the fact that they have a right to an attorney to represent and to be present at the time of questioning. Miranda supposedly was arrested for, I think, a burglary, if I'm correct, and supposedly he was not informed of his rights, and subsequently probably said some things that got him into trouble. He eventually was able to sue, and the case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and now police must inform criminals of their Miranda rights. And number 9, during the Kennedy years, the Supreme Court also handed down decisions that reaffirmed the separation of church and state. And some of these are things where we have to kind of go into the schools where, scripture readings and recited prayer could not be used within the public school setting. And these are things that are kind of hot topics even in this day and age, to the point where a lot of public schools have tried to distance themselves as much from church teachings or the church itself. It used to be a lot of public schools would have baccalaureate ceremonies at the time of graduation, or may have had a pastor come in and give a blessing to a graduation class. And now you can't do that in a public school setting. So certainly things have changed. Thank you very much.